Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're interested in starting a podcast, then Podcaster's Paradise is an invaluable resource for you. With step-by-step video tutorials, a tremendous number of resources and templates, and daily support, Podcaster's Paradise is by far the most important resource for any aspiring podcaster. Plus, if you join Podcaster's Paradise through my link, then I will promote your podcast on the show. Check out Podcaster's Paradise at placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Hi, everyone. On today's episode, I talked to Larry O'Dell, the state historian of Oklahoma. We take a journey through about 200 years of Oklahoma history and look at significant figures, significant events, significant ways in which Oklahoma has been relevant in pop culture, and some of the most defining and interesting characteristics of Oklahoma and the way that the rest of the country perceives Oklahoma and Oklahomans. So I hope that you'll enjoy today's conversation with Larry O'Dell about the state of Oklahoma. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Larry O'Dell about key figures and events in the historical and cultural development of Oklahoma. Larry is state historian with the Oklahoma Historical Society. You can follow the Oklahoma Historical Society at okhistory.org. For more information, please check out the show notes page for this episode at placesandprofiles.com/3. Larry, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
All right. Well, I greatly appreciate you joining me today. Thank you so much. Let's go back to the 1830s or so and get started there on this journey through Oklahoma history. And I want to look at the establishment of Indian Territory and the Trail of Tears and what those events looked like in the context of Oklahoma and how that kind of sets the table for some of the things that are going to happen in Oklahoma in the ensuing decades and in the almost 200 years since then.
Yeah, in the 1830s, as you said, the five tribes, used to be called the five civilized tribes, but they're called the five tribes now. The Chickasaw, Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, and Creek were forcibly relocated to Oklahoma. That's what's known as the Trail of Tears as their travel here. And I like to always tell people, if you think the tribal members had a hard time with the Trail of Tears, these five tribes also adopted Southern culture. So they brought slaves with them. So think about their slaves having to endure this Trail of Tears coming from the deep South to Oklahoma. They were originally given all of the state of Oklahoma except for the Panhandle, and they set up their nations.
So you mentioned that they were bringing their slaves with them. So can you give a little more detail on what this journey looked like for the Native Americans who were coming, for the slaves who were coming? How many died along the way? How many made it to Oklahoma? What are some of the figures and stories, characteristics that you can provide to paint a fuller picture here of what happened?
Well, some of their journeys were not as strenuous as others, but some did die. We don't know an estimated number right now, but most of the population did make it to Oklahoma. And like I said, they were already Southern. They had houses and cabins. They did not dress as most people think American Indians dress. They dressed very Southern, with still keeping some of their cultural accoutrements too. And they held land communally, ended up raising cattle, agriculture. It was very, very Southern. The five tribes, the Chickasaw and the Choctaw, were the most Southern. They traded their slaves like slaves. Cherokee were leaned toward that too. The Creek actually were not as strict with their slaves, and many Creek ended up marrying African Americans and living together. And the Seminole, they were, they came from Florida, and most escaped slaves, a lot of escaped slaves joined them. And when they came to Indian Territory, they were treated as tribal members for the most part. A lot of times they would call themselves, they would pretend to be slaves of other Seminoles so that slave hunters coming up from Texas and the deep South wouldn't capture them and take them away. because there were slave traders coming to Oklahoma to try to get these slaves.
Now, earlier you mentioned the term five civilized tribes. Can you very quickly explain what made these tribes civilized in the context of that term? What distinguished them from some of the other tribes at the time?
That was because of how adapted they were to the Southern culture already. They acted like Americans for the most part. So the white America coined the phrase five civilized tribes, unlike the Plains tribes and nomadic tribes of the West.
All right, so let's fast forward a little bit to the American Civil War. You mentioned that a lot of these tribes, a lot of these people who came to Oklahoma, these Native Americans who came to Oklahoma had slaves. So when we get to the Civil War, what role does the Indian Territory play in the American Civil War? What role do these five tribes play in the Civil War? And how does the abolition of slavery there compare with the abolition of slavery in the rest of the country?
Sure. The five tribes all made treaties not treaties. They all signed on with the Confederacy. Yeah, treaties. They made treaties with the Confederacy, but not all their tribal members fought for the South. Some fought for the North. It was kind of a microcosm of the United States. Some fought for the North, some fought for the South. The first battles were actually tribe on tribe, with Apathola trying to escape Indian Territory to Kansas, and the other Southern tribal members fighting a running battle with them. So this was the American West. There were, for most of the Civil War, it was Union and Confederates in Oklahoma. That changed with the Battle of Honey Springs, which was the biggest battle in Indian Territory. And that was the first action for the first Kansas Colored, which was a unit of African American soldiers. They even had a skirmish before the ones in the movie Glory. They fought before them. The Battle of Honey Springs, which pretty much killed the Confederacy in Oklahoma, the first Kansas was right in the middle. They were the heart of the Union troops. And the Union side, even though they were outmanned, ended up winning. And with many of their generals and colonels saying it was because of the first Kansas Colored. And what's interesting, and I've never found proof of this, but a lot of people say that Oklahoma has a lot of all black towns. And one of them is right there by the Honey Springs. And a lot of people say some of those soldiers came back and settled in Honey Springs. It hasn't been proven yet. But so that battle ended Confederates having any foothold in Oklahoma.
So what does the post-Civil War period look like in Oklahoma in the immediate aftermath of the war? Yeah, obviously, a lot of places to the east of Oklahoma and the south of Oklahoma were going through Reconstruction for up to another dozen years after the war came to an end. What does this look like in Oklahoma as the war ends in 1865, and the next steps are made as far as releasing slaves, integrating them into society? What does that look like, and what would later become Oklahoma?
First of all, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't get to, well, it got to Texas in June, and then it spread up to Indian Territory. So, of course, it didn't really free some of the slaves until the Civil War was over. But that's why Oklahoma and Texas celebrate Juneteenth, and it's spread across the nation. The United States government took the end of the Civil War as an opportunity to renegotiate the tribes' treaties in 1866. And so in these negotiations, they took half of Oklahoma away from the five tribes. So they took their land, but they also forced them to recognize their ex-enslaved people as tribal members, which the Chickasaw and Choctaw fought for a long time. Chickasaw never really recognized their ex-slaves, but so that's how these tribal members eventually ended up getting land. They got allotted land like most of the African Americans did not get in the rest of the United States. So, of course, they also settled near each other to create communities. So, but yeah, Reconstruction didn't hit Oklahoma like it, not hit, but it didn't apply to Oklahoma like it did many of the other states. So, but the tribes continued being a nation. They, like I said, acted like many other southern states, just in their own nations. And then the United States started using Western Oklahoma to relocate other tribes. So people think, all American Indians talk the same, or just these are all distinct nations and always don't get along within their own tribe, much less with other tribes. So the United States started putting more forts in Indian territory to keep the peace. So as we get closer to 1880s, or in the 1880s, there was a big boomer movement, which is clamoring for some land. And right in the middle of Western Oklahoma was an unassigned lands where they hadn't relocated any of the tribes. So in 1889, the United States opened up that land for non-Indian settlement. And so when the first land run happened, it brought in, all kinds of nationalities. All you had to do was be an American citizen to make the land run and claim land. But many people didn't have citizenship. There wasn't any way to really enforce that. And it also meant that American Indians couldn't make the land run because they were not citizens of the United States at the time. But more African Americans made the land run too. And in fact, exodusters are slaves from the South that moved to Kansas after the Civil War. Well, one of their leaders made the land run and even went to Washington, D.C. to try to make Oklahoma Territory an all-black state. They wanted to make it the territory of Lincoln. But of course, the non-African American land run people just overwhelmed them population-wise, and that never happened. But so if you're thinking about Eastern Oklahoma and the ex-enslaved people, they created all-black towns and communities. These African Americans that made the land run also created more all-black towns. So they opened up more and more territory as the Dawes Commission did their work. And the Dawes Commission took away American Indians' right to have communal land and made them get individual allotments, which opened up more land for more land runs or land lotteries. And of course, again, in the East, African Americans got their allotments together. And by the early 20th century, Oklahoma had more than 50 all-black towns and some communities in the state, which was more than any other state had. So you want me to just keep going?
Well, yeah. So we'll get back to these African American towns and the significance of all these African American people who were living in Oklahoma and some of the economic impact and some of the horrific tragedies that they had to endure as well. But a couple of things I want to touch on before we get there. So you were talking about the land rush, and one of the things for those that I live in Texas, and for those of us that don't live in Oklahoma, one of the things that's probably most associated with the land rush is the term Sooner, and Oklahoma becoming the Sooner state out of that. So how did that come about? Where does that term Sooner come from?
So the boomer are the folks that were making a lot of noise trying to get Oklahoma to open up the settlement. They even came into Oklahoma illegally many times and tried to create towns. And the interesting thing is that we had the folks that threw them out of Oklahoma once they would be Buffalo Soldiers, which was what a lot of the African American Union soldiers did after Civil War, is come to the West and be Buffalo Soldiers. And they were in the forts here in Oklahoma. Well, Sooners are people that hid or snuck on to the land to claim it before the gun actually went off that started it. So Sooners basically stole land in Oklahoma. Now, how it became an enduring term for a university, I'm not quite sure, but Boomer and Sooner always, sounded. And I went to the University of Oklahoma, so I know that really well. But yeah, the Sooners are the folks that snuck onto the land and stole land before the land runs happened.
All right. So a couple of things that I want to address, I said that I live in Texas, and obviously, parts of Oklahoma history are intertwined with parts of Texas history. And something that's, very prevalent in the minds of many people in Texas in the early post-Civil War period is the cattle trails and the cattle drives, going from Texas, driving cattle up to Abilene in Caldwell, Kansas, before they would be shipped off on rail cars to Chicago. Oklahoma obviously is right in between Texas and Kansas. So how was Oklahoma affected by these cattle drives, by these cattle trails? What sort of impact did that have on what would later become Oklahoma in this period between the end of the American Civil War and the onset of the land rush in the late 1880s?
Well, as the cattle trails started, they started in eastern Oklahoma and moved west. And that had economic impact on the 5 tribes in eastern Oklahoma because they would charge the cattlemen to come through their nations. So they had a steady amount of income from the cattle trails. And that's one of the reasons why they kept moving the trails west, is to get out of that. And plus, there were less people in the west, more people in the eastern Oklahoma. And another interesting fact that you probably know a lot, especially the early cattle drives, and the most of the ones from South Texas had a lot of Mexican or Hispanic cowboys that made these drives up through Oklahoma, and African American cowboys too. So they kept moving the trails further and further west, where there were less people, of course, and that's why the Chisholm Trail's where it is. It had two lines, the western and an eastern. When eventually the last trail that moved west was up through the panhandle of Oklahoma. So that was that was a boom. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but a lot of the 5 tribes had big ranches themselves, and they initiated drives from Indian Territory. So that was the cattle trail, and spawned movies like Red River with John Wayne.
Right. Well, and one other thing I want to ask about being a Texan, and I guess this might kind of be a minor piece of minutia, but there were various border disputes, since Texas was a state at this time, previously been an independent country, lost a lot of land in the Compromise of 1850 and the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. Mm-hmm. Texas was a state as of 1845. Oklahoma did not become a state until 1907, but there were these border disputes along here. The dispute in Greer County being perhaps one of the most notable. What exactly was that dispute about in Greer County, and how do we really start to see the shape that we know of as being Oklahoma today?
Okay. First, I want to address the panhandle. Like you said, the Compromise of 1850, Texas had to give away the panhandle because you couldn't have slaves above the 50th parallel. So that's eventually was called no man's land for a long time, and then it was attached to Oklahoma Territory. Greer County was a dispute, and it didn't come to Oklahoma until the 20th century. And that was, Texas thought it was theirs. And I'm not sure how much Oklahoma Territory even considered it until closer to statehood. But it ended up being part of Oklahoma, one of the last pieces of land that was not Oklahoma that was given to Oklahoma.
All right. And on the subject of statehood, you mentioned earlier attempts at forming the state of Lincoln out of much of the land that's currently Oklahoma. There was also a later attempt at forming the state of Sequoia. So what was that all about? What did the state of Sequoia proposal consist of? And then how do we actually end up getting the state of Oklahoma created in 1907? What brings that about?
Okay. There were 2 big movements as statehood was approaching: a single state or 2 states. Indian Territory, and this is mainly because of politics and who would be voting. Indian Territory wanted to create its own state and have Oklahoma Territory create its own state. So the Indian Territory had a convention called the Sequoia Convention, where they wrote out a constitution, guidelines, and everything for the state of Sequoia, which is interesting because a lot of the same people on the Sequoia Convention were in Oklahoma's Constitutional Convention. But to me, as a historian, and not finding out this till later, the Sequoia Convention, which had Alfalfa Bill Murray, very as he was in the Oklahoma Constitution, he was the chair president. He was very racist, very racist. When the Sequoia Convention, they had African American delegates. And when they created the Constitution of Sequoia, it's almost the exact same Constitution that was for Oklahoma. But when we had the Oklahoma Constitutional Convention, no African Americans were allowed on that Constitutional Convention. So Sequoia creates it. The people of Indian Territory vote to be a state and accept the state of Sequoia Constitution and everything else it did. But Theodore Roosevelt had always wanted it to just be one state. So him and a couple of legislators in D.C. tried to pass the state of Sequoia, but it did not pass. And Roosevelt was adamant that it would all be one state, and that's why we have both of the territories becoming the state of Oklahoma.
All right, so the state of Oklahoma is formed, officially established in 1907. And at the time, the capital was Guthrie, which might not be a community that a lot of people outside of Oklahoma have heard of, but a town north of Oklahoma City. Pretty quickly after that, the capital gets moved to Oklahoma City. What's the background with Guthrie? Why was that originally the capital? And then how did it lose its status as the capital shortly after statehood?
So pretty much the whole time the territory of Oklahoma was in existence, there was a Republican president of the United States, and they appointed governors of territory, so they always appointed Republicans. And from the very start of 1889, Guthrie was established as the capital of Oklahoma Territory. So when Oklahoma became a state, they wanted it to be Guthrie. The folks at Guthrie did, of course. Well, after statehood, Democrats took the majority of the politicians, and they didn't want to have the capital in the cradle of republicanism. So in Oklahoma City made more sense. It was in the center of the state. It was growing faster than Guthrie was. And so they had it put to the vote of the people. Oklahoma City won the vote. Guthrie sued, went to the court, and they had to have another election. And then Oklahoma City ended up being the capital in 1910. So that's how it moved from Guthrie to Oklahoma City.
All right. And you were mentioning there the role that Democratic and Republican politicians had in the years leading up to Oklahoma statehood and in the early years of Oklahoma statehood. Can you talk for a moment, though, about the political environment in general in Oklahoma at the time? Because today we think of Oklahoma as being this deep ruby red state where Republicans traditionally win elections statewide by large margins. When Oklahoma first became a state, though, in 1912, the second election that they participated in for president, the socialist candidate Eugene Debs had one of his best showings, the second best showing in Oklahoma, and the Socialist Party had strong footholds in Oklahoma in addition to the role that the Democratic and Republican parties were playing. So what did the political distribution, I guess, what did these political parties look like in the very early years, the first decade or so of Oklahoma statehood?
So the Populist Party was very popular in Oklahoma, and William Jennings Bryan, was very popular in Kansas and that area, and a lot of Oklahomans leaned towards that, which leaned more towards the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. And I will say first that Oklahoma's Constitution was very labor friendly. It was one of the longest constitutions in the United States, and it was very labor friendly. And the signers all gave their pens to William Gompers, who was a national labor union head. So it was very union friendly. And then out of that populism arose socialism. And in fact, like you said, in 1917, almost 20% of Oklahoma voted socialist ticket. What killed the Socialist Party in Oklahoma is called the Green Corn Rebellion, which was rebelling against World War I. And a lot of poor socialists actually were going to march to D.C., eat corn all the way. That's why it's called Green Corn Rebellion, and destroy bridges and power lines and telephone lines to protest. And they were shut down pretty quickly. But the anti-socialist party came it was the midst of a very patriotic time, and that pretty much destroyed socialism in Oklahoma in 1919. But like you said, Democrats ruled politics until the 1990s. Most of Oklahoma's history was fully Democratic stronghold.
And so why? And we'll get back to where we were chronologically here in a moment. But you said the Democratic Party had this stranglehold on Oklahoma politics up until the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
How were they able to do that? I mean, the Democratic Party, of course, had a lot of strength in the American South from the end of Reconstruction up through the Civil Rights era. But how were they able to maintain that hold in Oklahoma until the 90s? And then what really caused that change? Was this just a part of a national political realignment that Oklahoma got caught up in? What prompted that long reign for the Democratic Party, and now this, and then that significant swing that we've seen to where it's a very Republican-dominated state today?
So I like to tell people, if you look at the state of Oklahoma, you draw a line from Altus in the southwest corner up through Tulsa. Oklahoma is very southern below that line. That's because people settled that part of Oklahoma from Arkansas, Texas, and the deep south. And if you look above the line, it's very Jayhawker, Midwest, because people from Kansas settled up there. But it's more sparsely populated than the south and of Oklahoma. And the Republicans were up in the Northwest mainly, and could not compete with the Eastern Oklahoma and the population that was Southern. Newt Gingrich and what happened to most socialist states, or most democratic states, is what happened at Oklahoma. That, and Oklahoma's on the Bible Belt, and when Republicans started being the party of the church and religion, that helped put a nail in the Democrat. So that's how we did that, and that's why Democrats ruled for so long, and now it's deeply Republican.
If you're an aspiring podcaster, then joining Podcasters Paradise is an absolute must. Podcasters Paradise is a premium membership community that will help you create, grow, and monetize your podcast. With step-by-step video tutorials, resources, and templates, and daily support via the private Facebook group, Podcasters Paradise is the best place to learn how to be a successful podcaster. Joining Podcasters Paradise has helped me with my podcast in so many ways. It is truly a tremendous resource. Plus, as an added bonus, if you join Podcasters Paradise through my link, then after you launch your podcast, I will mention on my show and link to your podcast from placesandprofiles.com, as long as your podcast is not inappropriate and is not significantly opposed to my beliefs and values. Check out Podcasters Paradise and get started on your podcasting journey today by going to placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/paradise. All right, so let's go back to where we were chronologically. So you mentioned earlier the Green Corn Rebellion, resistance against the draft in 1917, the decline of the Socialist Party in Oklahoma. 4 years later, we have an event that's gotten, I guess, a renaissance and attention, maybe would be the way of phrasing it, in recent years, in what happened in Tulsa with the race massacre that occurred there in 1921. So what exactly was going on there? Earlier you talked about these predominantly or all African-American towns in Oklahoma. Tulsa had become a particular focal point of Black economic activity by that point. But what exactly happened with the race massacre in Tulsa, and what were some of the events that preceded it that led to its occurrence?
Okay, the very first bill that the Oklahoma legislature passed in 1907 was a Jim Crow law. It segregated trains and train stations, and then it just kept getting worse and worse. And many African Americans left. Some went to Canada, some went to Mexico, but they started leaving in droves. But in Tulsa, the African American community was known as Black Wall Street. They had a lot of money, and they circulated their dollars in their community. Well, they had to, because it was segregated. They couldn't go to white restaurants and white stores. And they had an African American leader there named A.J. Smitherman, who was their newspaperman. And he preached that there would never be a lynching in Tulsa, and that you had to protect your own race. So And there were, and he saw this in smaller towns because when there was any racial violence, he would go to the town and not only report on it, but talk to the population about, you got to we have to protect our community. So with smaller towns, it's not like a big town in Tulsa. So a young man, African American, was in an elevator with the elevator girl in Tulsa. She either slipped or he touched her. No one knows exactly what went on in that elevator, but she screamed, and one of the newspapers sent out this editorial saying they needed to get this guy, and he was in a jail, and the mob kept getting bigger and bigger around the jail. Well, leaders from the African American community came to the jail once, offering to protect Dick Rowland, was the young man's name, to protect Dick Rowland. He was turned away. They said, no, we've got this, but the crowd just kept getting bigger and bigger. They left, and then they came back again with their guns. And you got to remember, many of these African Americans were veterans of World War I. So they had fought. They had learned how to protect themselves. So they came, and the crowd was really big at this time. And the sheriff was like, yeah, no, we've got this. You guys can. Well, someone grabbed one of their guns, and it went off. And then they had to basically retreat to Greenwood with a gun battle. So the crowd started working their way up, went to get their guns and got bigger and bigger. And there was, violence in the city, but it hadn't really gone to Greenwood area yet. And then 5 a.m. the next morning, there was a whistle that was blown, and the white community invaded the African American community, burned down 35 square blocks, killed who knows how many people. I was a researcher for the Tulsa Race Riot. It's called Massacre now, but Tulsa Race Riot Commission back in the 98. So I was involved with all this research, and there's no way to tell how many died. African Americans died. The estimate is from 30 to 300. In fact, in Tulsa right now, they're exhuming graves and trying to find out unmarked graves and find out how many, if there were any African Americans from the right that perished and were buried at a certain location. So the governor of Oklahoma, Walton, sent the National Guard by train to Tulsa, but by the time they got there, the blocks were already destroyed. The African Americans were rounded up and put at the baseball field or at the Civic Center and detained. Many, ran to some of the all black towns or just had to get out of there. And it was one of the worst racial incidents in American history.
So what did this mean for the African American community in the ensuing decades in Oklahoma? What role did the civil rights movement play in Oklahoma? What it kind of came of the African American community and the aftermath of what happened in Tulsa in the 1920s?
So in Tulsa, neither the whites or the African Americans talked much about it. The whites thought it was a blemish on their town and tried to cover it up, even though just shortly after the riot, one of the biggest KKK buildings in America was built right next to Greenwood, called Beano Hall, and the KKK rose to prominence in Oklahoma. And they were a force in the 20s in Oklahoma for much of the 1920s. We had lynchings and violence in Oklahoma up until the mid-30s for the African American community. Tulsa, our state is so diverse, not only geographically, but by the people. I talked a little bit about the settlement. Tulsa and southeastern Oklahoma had the worst racial relations. They were bad, worse there. Oklahoma City wasn't as bad, and in the West there just wasn't a lot of African American communities. Jim Crow was really strong here. In the 1940s is when it started to get cracks in the Jim Crow laws in Oklahoma. Ada Louise Scipio Fisher sued the University of Oklahoma to become a law student there. Ended up winning eventually. I.W. Lane took the grandfather clause to the Supreme Court and got that struck. But it wasn't until the 50s that civil rights really took off in Oklahoma. And in fact, Clara Luper is one of our civil rights leaders. And she did a sit-in 2 years before Greensboro did sit-ins and opened up Oklahoma City restaurants to African Americans. And she actually reported on it the next year at the NAACP convention. And that's where Greensboro heard about how it transpired, and they went back and did it in Greensboro. So, but yeah, no, we were very Southern in Oklahoma up through the civil rights movement.
All right, so let's go back chronologically to where we kind of left off. So we were in 1921 with the Tulsa Race Massacre. We get to the end of the decade, and of course, we have the stock market crash in 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression. And for people who don't live in Oklahoma, a lot of maybe the way they perceive Oklahoma in large part is based on the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression and this concept of the Okie who's migrating from impoverished conditions in Oklahoma and going westward towards California. And in popular culture, John Steinbeck and Grapes of Wrath, the book and movie versions of that have kind of further cemented that sort of notion of someone from Oklahoma in that time period. So, just how large of an effect did the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression have on Oklahoma, and what exactly happened with westward migration? What were some of the impacts that time period had on the state?
So most people think of the Dust Bowl as Oklahoma being just hit by these dust storms. The Dust Bowl actually only affected the Panhandle and a little bit of northwestern Oklahoma, and many of those folks stayed. They didn't leave. The bigger effect was the Great Depression and the mechanization of agriculture. Most people, especially in eastern Oklahoma, were tenant farmers. They farmed other people's land for them. Well, as tractors became more and more popular and the Great Depression hit, it was a lot cheaper for these landowners to do it themselves with tractors, raise bigger and bigger fields. And the tenant farmers, they were, as the saying goes, dirt poor. So Okies and the actual Okie migration is mainly tenant farmers from eastern and central Oklahoma. And it's the same thing with Texas and Arkansas. They all got they all got called Okies because someone saw an Okie license plate in California. So that not only created this western migration to Arizona, but mostly California, where they thought the work was going to be abundant. It killed a lot of towns, including the all-black towns and smaller white towns, because railroads were being pulled up, tracks were being pulled up and shut down, and people were migrating from the rural areas to the urban areas of Oklahoma. So that's how it adversely affected Oklahoma. It was a very hard time for Oklahomans. We had a lot of what they call Hoovervilles, which is, people camps, basically, where people are living in boxes and shacks. And then in California, Okies fought a lot of discrimination. They were put into camps. And a lot of these Okies in California were interviewed by Steinbeck. And he actually got the story for the most part right in the Grapes of Wrath, but it very much upset the leaders of Oklahoma. So I like to tell people there are two things that came out of the Great Depression that have influenced Oklahoma in the future. One, World War II brought Oklahoma out of the United States out of the Depression, gearing up for war, spending money on war, getting jobs for people. That created more migration to California because they worked plants, war production plants in California and other places. But as World War II ended and all these young soldiers were coming home, Oklahoma leaders decided to put their money in a football team in Norman, Oklahoma, to offset the image of the Grapes of Wrath in Oklahoma. So they put a lot of money into the college football team and lured a lot of these World War II vets to college in Oklahoma using the GI Bill and playing football, and hired Bud Wilkinson as a coach, the assistant coach, and then eventually the coach. And the other thing was Oklahoma state song is Oklahoma from the musical. And that happened in 1950 because the leaders of Oklahoma, the first state song was terrible. It was awful. It was like a dirge. But to offset the image of Oklahoma again and to they've made Oklahoma the state song because it was such a popular musical and play at the time, and everybody knew it. So those two things occurred because of Steinbeck and the Grapes of Wrath image. And they
and the college football team, the musical, I mean, these very much still influence the way the state of Oklahoma is perceived nationally. In addition to what you're saying about the identity that's created amongst Oklahomans themselves.
Yes, definitely. It's two of our most known about things that we've put out into the world. Yeah.
All right, so a few more things I want to touch on before we wrap up for today. But you started talking about World War II there and in the context of what that meant for the Depression. But there's a different direction that I want to go with World War II. There's a rather unusual incident that happened in Oklahoma during World War II that's very unique to Oklahoma, and that's the accidental bombing of Boise City in the Panhandle in 1943, which I believe made it the only community in the continental U.S. to be bombed during World War II. So what was that all about? What exactly happened there? And did that at all affect the way Oklahomans viewed World War II, or was it just kind of brushed off for being an accident? What exactly was that story?
So Texas bombed us. Now there was an Air Force base in the Texas Panhandle that was practicing bombing runs, and they were using rubber bombs. They weren't using real explosives, but they got lost and they bombed the city of Boise City, hit a house, hit some sidewalks, did some damage to Boise City. So it is one of the only places in the United States that was bombed during World War II. That didn't really affect the view of most Oklahomans. Most Oklahomans didn't even hear about it, And again, like World War I and the Green Corn Rebellion, we were so patriotic at the time. It would not have, affected their thoughts on World War II here.
Well, and continuing on with that notion of Oklahoma and patriotism, we go to the 1960s, and there's a very famous song that, again, as looking outside inward, is sort of an anthem for the state of Oklahoma in some ways, and that's "Okie from Muskogee" by Merle Haggard. And I see you smiling as I'm saying this, so I guess you're licking your chops ready to talk about this. But what does that song say about the identity and the values of Oklahomans at that time, and how Oklahomans kind of viewed themselves as compared to some of the other things that were going on in the 60s?
So I've interviewed several of Merle Haggard's band members. We have a museum in Tulsa called OK Pop that we're building about Oklahoma and pop culture. And Merle, his family was from Chakotah, just by Muskogee. They were in a farm between Chakotah and Muskogee. And his mother was actually pregnant with him when they left to be Okie migrants. He wrote that song as a tribute to his father. So it was more about his father than that. But yeah, Oklahomans just took it to heart. There's a plaque in Muskogee that about it. And it was, very patriotic. And Oklahoma was patriotic at the time. There wasn't a whole lot of the hippie movement going on. There were at the universities in Oklahoma, but not with most of the teenagers and the people in the state itself. So that's another thing that we've contributed to Oklahoma, and I mean contributed to the world, is the song "Okie from Muskogee."
All right, so fast forwarding, let's go to the 90s, and again, an event that we have to talk about when covering the state of Oklahoma, and obviously this is a much different tone than discussing something like Oklahoma the Musical or Okie from Muskogee, but the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. For those like myself who are a little on the younger side and don't have a vivid image or a vivid memory of exactly what happened and what that meant at the time, what was that event and what did that mean both to people in the state of Oklahoma and nationally when that occurred in 1995?
I was old enough to remember it vividly. I was working in Norman, which is 30 minutes away from Oklahoma City, or 30 miles. And we could feel it at my job. I mean, it was a powerful blast. Destroyed half the Murrah building, which was the federal courthouse in Oklahoma. Timothy McVeigh did it as a protest against some of the things that, like David Koresh, David Koresh and how he was treated, and other.
Yes, yeah, David Koresh, the Branch Davidian leader in Waco. Yes,
how they were treated there, and how other Ruby Ridge and other things occurred. So he decided to take action against the government and chose Oklahoma City's federal building for some reason. So it was like 9:01 in the morning. The bomb goes off, kills many, many people. There was a nursery in the building, so there were children that died. Left a terrible effect on many of the firemen and policemen in Oklahoma City that had to deal with that and go through the rubble. So on the flip side, after the bombing, the city of Oklahoma City, its downtown was basically deserted. There was not a lot going on. And Oklahoma City had just started passing maps, which was raising sales tax in the city. And Oklahoma City, starting in right after the bombing, had a big revival, created a brick town area, reinvigorated its downtown. Eventually, out of those came its basketball team, because it was in a position where it could go after the Hornets when they had to leave New Orleans and prove that we could be an NBA city. So out of that, Oklahoma and Oklahoma Cityans kind of banded together to make this place a great place to live.
Well, and having an NBA team, having the Oklahoma City Thunder, and some of the success that they had when they first moved to Oklahoma, that certainly helped change the perception of Oklahoma nationally and globally, for that matter, as well, with how much of a global sport basketball is. So taking us up to the present day, we've seen a lot of population growth in Oklahoma in recent years. We're also nationally, we're seeing some economic changes where some of the industries that have been more prominent in Oklahoma, agriculture, we talked about some. We haven't really touched on oil and gas. I guess this is an opportunity to look at that briefly as well. But we're seeing some changes in some of these industries that have dominated large portions of Oklahoma's economy. So in terms of the growing population and these economic sectors, kind of how would you assess where Oklahoma stands in those areas as we head into the rest of the 2020s?
So Oklahoma has always had a boom and bust economy because of the oil industry. When oil is doing great and the barrels are at high price, our government does well. Everything does well in Oklahoma. When it kind of bombs, like the 80s, where the oil prices went way down, people stopped drilling and stuff, we have a hard time funding schools and doing things in Oklahoma. So that hasn't changed much. It's boom and bust. But we have, one of our oil companies created fracking and created different ways to get more and more oil out of the ground. And the agriculture industry is interesting because we've gone from single farm owners to these big corporate farms, these big, large farms. In the Panhandle of Oklahoma, there's large pig farms. In eastern Oklahoma, there's other large pig farms. The mom and dad farmer and rancher has kind of gone away in Oklahoma, and our urban cities have really grown in population, and our smaller towns are, fighting for survival at some time. Especially, like I said, there were over 50 all black towns. There's 13 now, and they're just barely surviving. They're trying to create cultural tourism to get national people to come to their towns and spend money in that way. So, but these new industries are helping, and it's changing our population. The Panhandle is 20% Hispanic now because of agriculture and some of the things that are going on up there. And we have a large Hispanic population all over the state of Oklahoma now, as well as other ethnicities that have come to Oklahoma. So, and mega churches, religion plays a strong part in Oklahoma, probably more than other states, except Texas and other southern states. But yeah, it's an interesting place to live. And it's like Florida and Texas and other places, they're starting to pass critical race theory and things like that. It's very part of the political environment that's going on right now.
Sure. And I want to wrap up our conversation in some ways where we started it, and that's by talking about Native Americans. And we earlier discussed Indian Territory and the Trail of Tears, and the 5 civilized tribes, but bring it forward to the present day. And Oklahoma still has a large Native American population. Nationally, it's still very much associated with having a large Native American population. Just how large of a Native American population is there in Oklahoma? How significant is the reservation system to Oklahoma? What's kind of the significance of Native American culture in Oklahoma in the present day?
We have 39 federally recognized tribes in Oklahoma. At the beginning of the 20th century, the federal government had this idea of assimilation, sending the kids to boarding schools, trying to take their culture away from them. When in the 1970s, everything changed. With allotment, they lost their government, their form of government. In the 1970s, they could create governments again. So most of the tribes have their own governments inside of Oklahoma. And then another big point for the tribes is they could, on their historic land, they could create casinos, which has really had a boom for them economically. The 5 tribes, especially the Chickasaw, expanded out of just casinos into having other industries using their funds, and are some of the richest tribes in the nation, especially the Chickasaw Nation. Western tribes, which were, not like the 5 tribes to begin with, they have a harder time and less population, less opportunities for casinos and other things. But the 5 tribes are very strong in Oklahoma, and with the recent McGirt case, have more sovereignty now than they've had in 100 and something years.
All right. Well, on that note, Larry, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. If anyone listening to this wants to learn more about your work or learn more about the sorts of topics that we've been discussing today, where would you direct them? What would you recommend they take a look at?
The best thing to do would go to okhistory.org and go to the publications tab, and we have an online encyclopedia called the Encyclopedia of Oklahoma. And there you can read about all these topics we discussed and a whole lot more that we didn't. So that would be the best resource, and each article has a bibliography if you want to learn more.
All right. Well, that sounds great. And I want to remind everyone to go check out the show notes page for this episode. That'll be at placesandprofiles.com/3, placesandprofiles.com/3. And we'll have links there to the Oklahoma Historical Society and some other resources relevant to today's episode as well. And Larry, again, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and for joining me today to discuss the state of Oklahoma. I enjoyed taking this journey through Oklahoma with you. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.